Hello, is this the right level for everybody? Good. And by the way, this is not just to remind you, but to remind me now's the time to turn mobiles off, or pages, or whatever. Okay, let me tell you about Gil. Gil is a lively 3-year-old with a tremendously bubbly personality, good-natured, good-looking, with a smile that's impossible not to respond to. Very sort of impish behaviour that sometimes leads him into trouble, but also makes it sort of rather hard to be cross with him for long. A bundle of life with everything to look forward ahead of him. Except that won't happen. And his life ended when he was 3 years old as a result of a freak car accident, and every good thing that might have been will now not be. And of course the question that everybody who knew him asked was why? Why did it happen? What was the point? What had this lovely 3-year-old done to deserve his life cut short? And the 5 of us, that's myself and his parents and relatives, who stood by his bedside, who saw him breathe his last breath and then lie still forever, also, you know, we didn't need to ask, we just looked at each other, and that was the question. And of course, it's not a new question. There are so many tragedies that you will know personally or that you will read about every day that just seem so senseless. Individual tragedies such as Gil, or such as a pregnant mother who's sort of killed by a car, stolen by joyriders that spins out of control. Collective tragedies such as, so many on there, 500,000 Rwandans, the starving Biafrans, the persecuted Yazidis, the 6 million Jews, the Ebola victims today. Intellectually, we know that acute suffering is constantly around us, but emotionally, of course, we feel it most when it actually hits somebody we know, someone we worked with. And that's why, the Anne Frank Day, or Anne Frank, has become such a potent symbol. You can't really identify with 6 million people, but you can identify with one little Dutch girl. And if I ask you now, just think for a moment of the television programme that perhaps has the worst horrific violence, that perhaps is the most, or should be the most X-rated programme, then I think the obvious candidate is the 10 o'clock news, which brings pain and brutality and terror into our living room in front of us every night. And we may sigh, but you know something? What's really astonishing is what happens next. Is that we're still able, despite our sighs and our moans and our groans, to complain a few minutes later at the weather forecast that then follows it, and when the rain and what the rain's going to do and how it's going to ruin our shopping or golfing plans the next day. And that's not because we're flippant, it's simply because we're resilient. Life goes on, and if we bowed our head at every tragedy that occurred, we'd never look anyone in the face again. And it's just sort of every now and then that a particular tragedy stops us in our tracks, stuns us with the waste of it all, and presents us with these question marks, and begs us to find some sort of meaning in it. So, what are the possible answers to that 3-letter albatross that hangs round our neck? Why? And that weighs us down. And I say answers, you probably heard that, plural, very deliberately, because it's not giving the game away to suggest that there's actually no one Jewish solution that makes sense to everyone. We're different people facing different situations. Some of us have family, some don't have family, some with support, some without support. Oh, and by the way, having family and having support are not necessarily the same thing. So different responses will ring true for different people. And what's more, within each of our own lives, we all go through different stages. And what sort of holds true at one point in our lives can change at a later point. Life is not static, and so often it catches us by surprise. So I'm going to offer a variety of answers that Jewish searching has thrown up over the ages. And of course some of them are ones you'd expect, such as that of one of the greats There's about 4 or 5 greats in Jewish tradition, one of which is Rabbi Akiba, 2nd century rabbi, who was convinced that everything was part of God's plan, and what's more, that it was all for the good. In fact, he had a little motto, Gam Zo L'Tovah, which means it's all for the good, everything's for the best. For instance, there's a famous story about and whether it's true or not, by the way, is irrelevant. There's truth in it, so to speak. He was apparently travelling through a forest with some companions. He got separated from them. He knew that there were brigands in the area, and therefore he was rather worried about being alone. But nothing he could do about it, so never mind, he said, Gam Zo L'Tovah, everything's for the best. And when night fell, he made a small camp by himself. He did have with him his donkey, some books and a candle. But out of the darkness, bang! A wolf pounced and killed his donkey. It meant that Akiba now would have to carry on foot the following day, but never mind, Gam Zo L'Tovah. And he settled down, read his book by his candle, until a gust of wind blew it down. What did he say? Well, you know what he said. He said, Gam Zo L'Tovah, all is for the best, and went to sleep. Sounds a bit like Pangloss, doesn't it? Now, next morning, he continued on his way, only to find his companions lying dead, not far from him. And if he hadn't got lost and hadn't been separated, he probably would have been murdered along with them. If his donkey hadn't been killed, the brigands might have heard it braying. If the candle hadn't blown out, they might have spotted his light. Everything's for the best, said Akiba, Gam Zo L'Tovah. Now, of course, a bit simplistic, but in Akiva's case, he was able to see the positive actions of his problems, or the positive outcome of his problems shortly afterwards. There are also times, of course, when we can't see any good coming from our problems until several years later, sometimes never at all. The familiar image, of course, of the tapestry that on one side is a hodgepodge of strands, on the other side is a master design of beauty. And just because we can't see the design doesn't mean it isn't there. Absolute stuff and nonsense. Says Rabbi Elisha ben Abuya, who can't stand that sort of answer. He, by the way, was a contemporary of Akiva, and he made this outburst because of a peculiar situation that occurred to him. He saw a student faithfully keeping one of the commands in the Bible, in the Exodus, that if you are about to if you see some eggs in a nest, rather than just take them, you should shoo the mother bird away if she's watching from a different branch, so that she doesn't have the pain of seeing it. It's a sort of, considering animals, acting in a good way, whatever. Anyway, so this student climbed the tree, got the eggs, shooed the mother bird away, and clambered down, fulfilling the command rather than just grabbing them and not caring about the mother bird. And as he came down the tree, there was a snake waiting for him, which bit him, and he died of the wound. Ha, said Elisha. He did God's commands, and God stopped him, caused him to be killed. So what is the point of keeping God's commands? And he became an atheist, very early example in the 2nd century of a Jewish atheist. A very unhappy atheist, by the way, because it meant he lost all his support group, and also because atheists also don't have all the answers. And it still didn't give him any answers, he just knew there wasn't a simple solution. In fact, that led another 2nd century rabbi, a chap called Yanai, to keep his faith by adopting the solution of just throwing his theological hands up in horror and saying, the reason for good and evil is not in our hands. In other words, admitting, I don't know, I won't ever know, so there's no point even trying to ask the question, and it's better not to ask the question in the first place. And not seeing any cause, even if you believe that somehow it is there, can be very frustrating though. It's a very hard thing to do what Yanai said and say, right, just going to carry on with life. And there's a very famous story that in fact got made into a television program a few years back that goes back to the Holocaust, of 5 rabbis in a Nazi concentration camp who decided, amid all the horror of Auschwitz and the terrible things, that enough was enough. God had to be held accountable for all the atrocities going on around them, and which couldn't possibly have any benefit. So they held a trial. This was the famous trial of God in Auschwitz, and they put God metaphorically in the dock. They argued for him, against him, and they argued for and against God's conduct in the light of what the Jewish people were suffering there and then, and they reached a verdict. And the verdict was that they were unanimous that God was guilty. They paused. Now what do? And then one of them provided the answer. He said, look, it's sunset. It's time for the evening prayers. And so they started their service. In essence, therefore, they carried on. They maintained a structure that allowed room to express their dissatisfaction, but they didn't opt out. What they did do was they shouted out their pain. Fair enough, others would say, but then these rabbis, you could argue, missed the point. Providing evidence for and against God, looking for immediate cause and effect, that is really barking up the wrong tree in the first place. Who said that? Well, there's another one of the greats, a chap called Maimonides. He was a remarkable 12th century figure. He was not only a rabbi, he was a physician, he was a courtier, he was a philosopher, he was a legalist. He was certain that everything could be explained and sorted out in the next world. Then the righteous who suffered in this world would be rewarded, and the wicked would be, who had prospered in this world would be punished. Well, for many people that is the answer, and a very comforting thought. And also, of course, it has the advantage of being very hard to disprove. The trouble is, it's sort of religious finance on the never-never. And most of us would like to see what's what up front, here and now. In fact, some Jewish thinkers offer very concrete reasons for what is going on around us. There is a group called, I'm going to have to step over here. Right, there's a group called Lubavitch. You may have heard of them. In fact, they have a centre here, I believe, in Oxford. And there was a kibbutz in the 1970s in the Upper Galilee that was attacked by a PLO, and 17 children were killed in their beds. And immediately afterwards, people said, why? And the Lubavitch rabbi ordered that all the mezuzot, these are the little casements, which are put on Jewish homes and have a tiny scroll from the Bible on them, a scroll that's written by hand. You may have seen them if you've got a Jewish friend or been to the synagogue. All the mezuzot, they checked all the mezuzot, and do you know what they found? 17, same number as the children, were defective. Therefore, direct connection. And when, by the way, 3 more children died of the wounds, they did another check and found, guess what? 3 more were defective. Now, I have to say, it does not seem to me to be a particularly nice God who takes children's lives because one of these bits of metal has got a defective scroll inside. But for some people, and although I find this appalling theology, I have to admit, for some people, that is helpful because it answers the question. And some people prefer to have a bad answer than no answer at all. What's more, it also gives people a certain control, because if you don't want tragedy to occur, you can avoid it by keeping your mezuzot in good shape. Of course, if you go too far down that route, it leads to sort of medieval amulets and all the rest of it, so that's not for me. But let's go back to the Holocaust, because the interesting thing was that of all the Jews that suffered, that it was actually the most orthodox, particularly the large concentration of Jews in Poland and Russia, that were hit the most. They lost something like 90%. 90% of the East European Jews died, compared to the assimilated German Jews, who were much more assimilated, much more integrated, who only lost 50% of their numbers. So it seems that the kosher mezuzot, or the kosher amulets, didn't protect the ultra-Orthodox after all. So what was the explanation for that? Aha! Says Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman, who was a theologian, Orthodox theologian, at that time and in the post-Holocaust world, and he introduced a very new concept. And he said, the ultra-Orthodox died not because of their sins, but because of the sins of the generation. Now, in some ways that's sort of quite appealing. We're sort of responsible not just for our own lives, but what happens in society. We can't isolate ourselves from others. And so if there is social mayhem or religious degradation or immorality in society, we can't just walk away and say, I'm pious, nothing to do with me, mate. But we've got to sort of get involved, get stuck in. And if they go astray, we must somehow do something or be held responsible for not taking action, a bit like Abraham trying to save the lives of those in Sodom and Gomorrah. But in another sense, it's quite appalling. I mean, why should one person suffer for the sins of someone else, thousands of miles away, and with whom actually there is no point of contact? Why should the Orthodox Jews in Russia suffer because of the assimilated Jews, German Jews there in Berlin? Well, some people will say, as you probably heard, out of the ashes comes forth goodness. This is a rabbi called Rabbi Brister. He said, from the Holocaust was born the State of Israel 3 years later, 1948. I'm not sure about that line of argument, because I suspect that Israel would have happened anyway, perhaps a bit later, perhaps in the middle 1950s. The Holocaust just made it a bit easier for it to occur. And anyway, I'm not sure if that can ever be compensation. You can't have compensation theology. And if we were to be given the choice of having Israel, but at the cost of 6 million lives, I don't think we could do anything but refuse and say that the asking price was too high. But let's return to individual ups and downs. There's no doubt that suffering can refine us. And I'm sure you've met this either in your own life or seen it in other people. There are those who faced tragic loss and have often said that they surprised themselves at how they managed to cope, that they emerge stronger people, more caring, more appreciative, more sensitive. And they often then go on to inspire other people with their lifestyle and insight. But again, I'm not sure about that. I can't believe in a God who uses individuals as a sort of divine blackboard, who cripples or terminates one person's life in order to educate somebody else. There was a lady called Beruria. She knew about suffering. She was actually a famous teacher, female teacher, again in the Talmud, the compendium of rabbinic literature in the 2nd century. She's perhaps cited sometimes, I'm not sure if it's accurate, but as the first female rabbi. And there's a famous episode when her husband, also a scholar, was out. She had 2 young children who suddenly died. Some disease suddenly took hold of them. She cried, she mourned them, and then she prepared herself to tell her husband when he came home later that evening. And she did it through a parable, telling him about how some years earlier a friend had lent her 2 jewels for an indefinite period, and how Beruria had derived much pleasure and joy from those 2 jewels. But then, out of the blue, the friend had returned and asked for the jewels back. And she said to her husband, "What should I do?" And the husband said, "Well, no question about it. Give back the jewels to the source from which they came." And at that point, she then, according to the story, leads her husband into the room where the 2 dead children lay, and she uttered the words that's actually now come as part of the Jewish funeral service. Adonai natan, Adonai lakach, Shem Adonai mavorach. The Lord has given, the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be blessed. In other words, acceptance. Recognizing that ownership, like the children, like the jewels, is not ours by right forever. It's a passing moment. At best, it's a stewardship. And then we have to let go. May the name of the Lord be blessed. And appreciate what we have and be lucky enough to have in the first place, even if it was shorter than we wanted. Sounds good. A lot of people find that quite helpful, but it can be hard to follow in practice. And maybe Aaron's way is more realistic. Aaron, of course, the brother of Moses, he lost 2 sons, you may remember in Leviticus chapter 10 and 11. They were already young men, but they were still his sons. And they were struck down mysteriously for some reason that doesn't quite make sense. Maybe it did in biblical times, it's hard to know. Like Beruria, Aaron lets go. He recognizes that we may choose what to wear, what to eat, who to eat with, but the two most important aspects of our lives, its beginning and its end, are beyond our control. But there is one crucial difference. Unlike Beruria, Aaron can't bless God. Can't say, the Lord has given, the Lord has taken, may the name of the Lord be blessed. He can't bring himself to actually say, yes, you've given, now you've taken away, and that's fine by me. It isn't fine. It hurts badly. He knows he doesn't have any say in the matter, but he still wants his sons back. So what does he do? And the Bible in one just 2 words says, and Aaron, there's 2 words in Hebrew, 4 in English, and Aaron was silent. Of course, he was full of anger, full of grief. Most of all, he was full of questions, but he knew that words couldn't answer pain, and that explanations can't compensate for dead children. For him, silence was the only way out. Not for Job. We all know about his story, the successful individual who worked hard over many years, built up a fortune, a family, and then all comes tumbling down. His property is destroyed, his sons and daughters die, and Job neither blesses God nor is silent. But he sort of writhes around, doesn't he? Writhes around in agony. Why me? Friends come and try and comfort him, but to no avail. And in the end, it's quite a long book, and in the end, God steps in and God speaks to him directly. And effectively, God tells Job to stop whinging about all the things he doesn't like, when he never asked why, when all the things that he did like happened. And God reminds Job that life comes as a package, some of it to our liking, some of it not to our liking, and much of it a mystery. And way beyond our ability to create anything similar. Where were you, thunders God, when dawn and morning and dew were formed? Did you give the horse its strength? Did the eagle soar at your command? No, you may think the world revolves around you, but in reality the world is neither for you nor against you. And it will carry on long after you. Accept your small place within it and make the most of it. Now, that was Job in the Bible. A modern American rabbi whose book you may have read because it came over here, became very popular. It was called When Bad Things Happen to Good People by Rabbi Harold Kushner. He actually takes a similar line. He shies away from the idea of God making specific decisions that affect you and me. This person worth dying of cancer, that person in a car accident, this person in their mid-40s, that person in their 90s. God, he says, is responsible for the world and is the source of life, but the world has a motion of its own. And people, you and me, are in control of it. They, you, me, we make bad decisions or good decisions. We decide whether or not to have too much to drink before driving. While in the case of natural disasters and disease, well, that just proves how unpredictable and dangerous a place life is. That when we're born, we're not born into a mill pond. We're born into a sea. And a sea can be both smooth and raging. It can provide an easy passage, and it can also be full of hidden dangers. It can change from one to the other suddenly and without warning. That's a situation from day one, says Kushner, although we only tend to realize it when we hit some of those hidden dangers. And God? Where does God come into it? Well, God comes into it twice. First, in the gift of life itself, simple statement upon which we all depend, and then God comes into the response we make. That we can be among those who help tame that sea of life or stir it up. That we can add to the dangers or seek to minimize them. And that when other people face trouble, we can walk away or we can lend a hand. It's the voice of God within us that says, care, be responsible, make it a better place, that urges us to visit lonely individuals, to comfort a bereaved person, to work in hospitals, to organise outings for the disabled, to develop implements and technology to help the limbless, to give up an hour to read a book to the blind, to donate money to help with cancer, to build a hospice for the dying. The voice of God that says, don't just swim on, take an interest in others around you. And don't just tread water, ensure that your existence here on earth makes a difference. And in that context, one of the most impelling religious statements comes from a 2nd century rabbi, Tarfon, which a long time ago, also in the Talmud, and which has become a slogan for Jewish social action today. And he says, you may not be able to complete the work, but neither are you free to neglect it. Which can apply to all sorts of situations we find ourselves in, where we can't do as much as we like or as much as is needed, like prevent thousands from dying in famine in Africa, or stop all global warming. And whereas we could, yes, just throw up our hands in despair at the vastness of the task, the impossibility of completing it, and do nothing, instead we can still do our bit, contribute to feeding some of the starving, minimise some of the unnecessary overheating, play a role, do what we can, hoping that if others act likewise, lots of small efforts can build up into a tsunami of action, even if that too does not complete the work, it will still have a massive effect. And for those who are not sure if they're up to the task that's thrown at them out of the blue, then that same Talmudic book, Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, has another passage which says, in a place where there are no men, be a man. It's a passage written, of course, in the days before PC, gender-inclusive language, but meaning that whatever's required of you, that even if it's something you wouldn't normally expect of yourself, like offering a calm word when you'd normally panic, or trying a tourniquet at an accident when you don't know how, or going off to help someone you see them in need. Don't say, sorry, can't, above my pay grade. You step up to your mark and you do your best. Perhaps we should sort of reword it and say, in a place where there are no heroes, be a hero. And that can apply not just to the people helping, but also those being helped, the victims. I'm thinking now of the example, I'm sure you remember it, of the 33 Chilean miners who were trapped underground for 69 days when the mine collapsed on them back in 2011. Now, it could have been so easy for men certain in their own minds that they were facing death to have panicked, or to have fought, or to have given up. But they had the inner resource not to. They called on reservoirs of strength that they did not know they had, and never gave up hope. And in that, you may have heard, because he said it on the radio once, the story the late Rabbi Hugo Gryn used to tell about when he was a child with his father, also in Auschwitz concentration camp, and how in December his father had put aside some of his sparse food ration of margarine because he wanted to light it, to use it to make a makeshift sort of oil for a makeshift Hanukkah, the candelabra at the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. At which point the young Hugo, 10, 11, 12, whatever, cried out to him to stop. It was a waste of precious food, precious rations, that margarine, not to use it, to burn it for the festival. At which point he was told by his father, you can live 3 weeks without food, and 3 days without water, but you cannot live 3 minutes without hope. And for Hugo's father, giving up that margarine wouldn't have made much difference, but letting go of their identity as Jews, as humans, as people with a future, that would have killed them. And so too with the miners, who surprised not just the entire world, but also who surprised themselves by not giving up hope. But all the reactions I've mentioned so far of individuals, whether it's of victims or rescuers, and what was so striking about another horror story that I'm going to mention and end with was not so long ago in Norway, and you remember the shootings of the dozens of teenagers of the island of Utøya. And what was fascinating was the national response. The near universal reaction of Norwegians, not to say, we need more police, we need more security, more around our schools and youth camps, and thus allow one deluded murderer to poison a whole society. Instead, the reaction was, we must be true to ourselves. Continue as before. Let our values that have served us so well, apart from this terrible and isolated incident, continue to serve us. And you may also remember the famous words of the Norwegian Prime Minister at the time, Jens Stoltenberg. He said, "You will not destroy us. No one will stop Norway from being itself." And his vow that the response would be more democracy, more openness, more humanity. A response which was echoed then by the population at large, and which said, we shall not change our way of life. We shall recognise the exception as an exception, which is maybe what they have to do in Ottawa at the moment, and not let him alter the rule. Very reasonable, you might say, but it could have been so different. Looking for scapegoats, pointing fingers, turning inwards, blaming immigrants, blaming politicians, blaming one another. Instead, it was a national example of staying calm, working together, and looking for the common good. Now, of course, all of these incidents that I have quoted have been in the past. And I'm sure tomorrow, next week, next year, whatever, there will be more tragedies, more suffering, which will occur and which will leave us asking those questions, why, feeling overwhelmed. But ultimately, I suppose this is the Jewish view, if there is one, ultimately, when confronting suffering and tragedy, the most important question is not why did it happen, but what do I do next? How do I respond? And that is in our power to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. Before we kick off with questions, there's just a comment I would like to make. I was particularly glad you included the talk, the trial of God at Auschwitz. And it occurred to me, although their response was wonderfully timed and beautiful in itself, one of the things that I think you as Jews have over us Christians, both of us sharing the Old Testament, is that you seem much more capable than we are to rant.
To rant?
To rant.
Right. Yeah, well, rants are good because it gets it out of the system and allows you then to, as long as you don't rant too nastily. Ranting at God's one thing, ranting at people is a little bit more hurtful. God can take it.
Well, exactly.
I'm not sure if your neighbour can.
Years and years ago when I saw Fiddler on the Roof for the first time, I was quite shocked to see Topple shouting at God. And now I think how wonderfully refreshing it is to get out.
Yeah, let me just pick that up because you might have thought, oh well, that's just a musical, but actually it was based on a sort of Jewish tradition, going right back to for instance, there was a famous rabbi in the 18th century who got up one year at the most holy of days, the Day of Atonement, got up in front of the ark and said, God, we have sinned, we've done awful things, we have cheated, we've lied, we've stolen, we've committed adultery, we haven't had a good year. But actually, nor have you. You've created hurricanes and earthquakes, and there's been starvation and disease and famine, and we will forgive you if you will forgive us. Now, a bit audacious, but again it goes right back to the Jewish tradition of Abraham, and you remember I mentioned that Sodom and Gomorrah, and instead of Abraham accepting that God was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, he objected, and he said, why? And he bargained with God, if I can find 50 righteous people, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. And so in other words, the Jewish approach is not just, yes, of course we live in the light of God, but we're not just snivelling on our knees all the time, but we can sparkle back every now and then.
Can I just quickly say something, Geordie? It suddenly made me realise that perhaps I am Jewish. I've been ranting all along.
And by the way, I'm very happy to take questions both on what I said and also what I didn't say, or any other aspects of Jewish life. So feel free.
Please wait for the microphone, otherwise we won't hear your question.
Thank you for that, Jonathan. That was a wonderful talk. I now have the opportunity, after a number of years, to ask you what you meant by something you said to me many years ago. And I'm going to quote you back to yourself. At the time, I didn't have a chance to explore it further with you. But what you said was, Lynn, you don't have to believe in God. You just have to do what He says. Can you say a bit more about that, please?
Yeah. Yes, this is one of my favourite Jewish sayings, actually. That to be a good Jew, you don't have to believe in God, you just have to do what He says. And this is perhaps one of the differences between Judaism and Christianity, in that Christianity is very, very good at theology. And you spend hours and reams and books and sermons and so forth on theology and belief. Whereas if you go to to synagogue, the sermons are all very different. They tend to be not on belief and faith. They tend to be very much on action and doing and how to cope with cancer and business ethics and so forth. If you ask Jews to define God, well, we just say God is, and we don't. In heresy, in Judaism, it's not the person who believes the wrong thing. So we've never had the battles like you've had between the sort of Catholics and the Protestants and the Anabaptists or all that lot. It's just very un-Jewish because, what you think about God is totally irrelevant. Because God is, whether you think about it or not and so forth. What really counts is what you do. Sometimes we go a bit overboard on that, on the doing side. And we've got, as you probably know, not just the 10 Commandments, but the 613. Derived from the 5 books of Moses. And I mention that because, in fact, there are a lot of Jews who are members of synagogues who are atheists, or certainly agnostics. And they often say, well, I'm not sure about this God business. And I say, so what? God's not like the fairies, where every time you say in Peter Pan, I don't believe in fairies, one of them dies. God exists. What really counts is you and what you do, and whether you go out and you sort of help an old lady with her shopping, or you knock her over in front of a bus. It's doing things. That's what counts. I wrote a book, in fact, you mentioned it, called Faith and Practice, which is about what Reformed Judaism does and believe and practices. And actually, one of your former bishops, Richard Harries, reviewed it, and he said, this is a typical Jewish book. It's 300 pages, it's 280 on what to do, and 20 on about God. If it was a Christian book, it would be exactly the opposite way around. Now, I don't know whether that's quite true, but it just means that Judaism is very much about behaviour. And the God business, well, we've got ideas, but it doesn't really matter. Does that answer you?
It does, thank you.
I wonder if you could comment on being Jewish. There's obviously a religious portion and there's a genetic portion.
Yes, you're quite right. And one of the strange things about Judaism is how to define it, in the sense that, it's the eternal argument, is it a race, is it a religion? And of course it's neither, and it's both. It's not a race. It's not a race, because people can become Jewish, and although we're not a missionary faith, we believe that there are many paths to God. It doesn't really matter which one you take as long as you get there. It doesn't matter whether you call God Jesus or Christ or Allah or Buddha or Adonai or whatever. It's having that relationship, or that act, following the commands and being a good person. So you can become Jewish. On the other hand, it's not just a religion, because as I said, there are many Jews who don't believe, who are not religious. I don't really think you can be a Christian if you don't believe in the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. I would have thought, a bit hard, really. Whereas there are many Jews who don't believe in the existence of God, but who talk Jewish, act Jewish, laugh Jewish, eat Jewish, practice Jewish, because it is this curious mix. So that's a muddled answer, but it's the best you're going to get.
Just like to say that whether it wasn't.
Sorry, do you want to shout that out? I can't hear.
I'd just like to say that Buddha wasn't a god.
Right. So, fair point, thank you.
I'm afraid that I'm somewhat deaf, and I did not hear what it was that Aaron said. And it sounded as though it was rather significant in the story, so I wonder if you'd mind repeating it.
Well, curiously enough, you're not as deaf as you think, because he didn't say, the point was he didn't say anything. The Bible says, it's Leviticus 11 verse 3, chapter 11 verse 3, and it says, and Aaron was silent. Because sometimes that's the only response, or the only coherent response. Yes, we can rant, we can rave, we can scream, we can shout, but usefully, sometimes it's better just to be silent. So he accepted, reluctantly, painfully, sadly, because that's all you can do. Because in a sense, the worst response is not to accept. And to continue saying why, when actually it's too late, it's done. And you've got to move on, in terms of grief, in terms of your own personal life, in terms of the next stage. But of course, Aaron's answer isn't for everybody. As I said, there are many, many different responses. Let me tell you a story, by the way, because I wanted to mention it, and no one's asked the right question for me to say it. I want to tell you about Henry. Henry was a member of my community who had a son who was a pretty good chap. He was 19, one of these all-rounders. He was quite bright, he was a good sportsman, he was likeable. He was going off to university, he played football, and he had a moped, and he went on his moped to his sort of evening football match, and on the way home, for some reason he came off his bike, fell in front of a car and was killed. And it was desperately sad, obviously, 19-year-old, and the police never really found out what went wrong. He wasn't drunk, he wasn't on drugs, he hadn't been having alcohol, it was a clear night, there was a full moon, there was no rain, there was no slippery, very hard to know why he came off his bike, wasn't speeding. I suggested, maybe a rabbit had, through a country, a rabbit had run through and he swerved, and I said, but he wouldn't accept that. He said, my son wasn't killed by a rabbit. It's not what I meant, but there we go. Henry, who was a member of the synagogue, never came, because again, he didn't believe in all this God business. But suddenly he started coming very regularly every Saturday. And after a few weeks, he said to me, you know why I come, don't you? And I said, no, tell me. And he said, because God killed my son to punish me for not being a good Jew and not coming to synagogue. So now I'm going to come to synagogue. And I said, Henry, I don't believe that. I don't believe that God, and not the God that I believe in, would punish you by killing your son. It just doesn't work for me. It's just, that's a horrendous concept of God. He said, no. And more or less every Saturday from then onwards, he would say to me, you know why I'm coming? And I'd say, Henry, don't go there. And every now and then I'd take it further and argue with him. And then the penny clicked, and I stopped arguing. Because I suddenly realised what was going on. And I don't know if you saw it or before I did. It gave him a reason. God had punished his son for him not coming to the synagogue. It wasn't a great reason, to me it was a horrific reason, but it gave him a reason. What he could not cope with was an unexpected, unexplained death that was random, that was out of the blue. That was even worse. As I said earlier, having a bad explanation is sometimes better for some people than no explanation at all. It also meant the world wasn't quite as random and horrific, because there was a system, a God in charge, maybe doing some nasty things, but at least there was a God in charge. And the other thing that I only clicked afterwards as well was he had a second son. And by coming to synagogue, he was protecting his second son against this vengeful God. So, to me, Henry's reason for coming to synagogue was utterly, utterly horrendous. In fact, I'd say it was wrong. I said I shouldn't say that, because for him it was right. So it goes back to the point of different explanations apply to different people in different ways. And that also, of course, we all have our own way of mourning, we all have our own way of dealing with grief. And it's not a matter of right or wrong, it's a matter of what works best for us and what's most helpful.
A very interesting talk, and I wondered if you could say a bit more about the Book of Job and what it represents, because I think in the Christian tradition it's a reference point for explanations of suffering. And what struck me about the Jewish presentation, that God exists and that is your basic premise, not challenged. What about forces of evil, Satan, who appears in the temptation of Job?
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting that Satan, who does make a sort of guest appearance in the Book of Job for the first time, is an angel, isn't he? Or rather, he's under God's control. You see, and that's probably the Jewish position in the sense that Satan is never seen as a sort of a fallen person, somebody who, in the Bible at least, who is anti-God. But Job is in the Book of Job is very clear that God has a court, and there's a defense lawyer and the prosecuting lawyer. And the prosecuting lawyer, also the defense lawyer is called X or Y or Z, and the prosecuting lawyer is called Satan. So in other words, the prosecuting lawyer, Satan, is part of the system, and is part of God's setup, and not opposed to God, but he's doing God's will in prodding, teasing, trying to find out. So that's a much more benign interpretation than in the Christian one. And of course, in a sense, both Christianity and Judaism have since departed from Job, because Christianity has seen Satan as a figure of evil, rather than a good person doing a difficult job. And Judaism has actually always never accepted Satan as a force for evil, and in fact we don't have any force for evil, and we would say, yes, there are bad things, but if there is evil, it's evil within us. There is no external devil that is tempting us. We are all born, firstly, with a clean slate, so we don't have this concept of original sin, because, to be honest, we feel that it's a bit unfair, stacking the odds against us from birth. But secondly, we'll say everyone's got the inclination to good and inclination to evil, or bad. And it's up to us which path we take. And we can give to charity, or walk past the person with the charity box. We can make snide remarks, or we can be helpful. We can scowl, or we can smile. So it's always within us. There's no external force tempting us. There's an internal force tempting us, saying, I want, me. But there's no external force. While you're walking over to the microphone, just let me tell you about this book. I scribbled quite a bit. This is a book about one of the topical issues of the day, which is assisted dying, which, as you may know, has passed its first reading in the laws, but may or may not become law. And it gives Jewish responses both for and against. It costs $9.99, but the publishers have said that when I go to churches and other religious buildings, you can have it at half price, so that's £5, and it's available afterwards from all good churches. Right.
Thank you for your talk, Rabbi. I know this religion, but I thought you said that Judaism is. Did you say that Judaism is only a religion and a Jews a race? Or I may have misunderstood what you said. Could you elucidate? I thought that Jewishness is Jews were a race and Judaism is a religion. But maybe
well, the trouble is it's hard to define. What I said was it's hard to define because it's a bit of both, because you can be born Jewish, but on the other hand it's not exclusively a race, because you can become Jewish and people can convert. So it's a bit of both, and it's very hard. I've never found the right word to describe it. So it's not just a race, it's not just a religion, and it's a bit of both, which is why there are religious Jews and irreligious Jews.
Just going back to your previous comment one about the origin of evil stuff. You asked about only
Well, why? I suppose I wouldn't even ask that question in the first place. I would say, well, why should it come from elsewhere? We are human, we have wants and needs, and everything we do can go both ways. I mean, ambition is a wonderful thing. Ambition is what makes us work hard or research or go and discover things, but it can also lead to extraordinarily selfishness, and it can be, at the cost of other people. So it's just, whatever abilities we have can be used for good or for bad outcome. So I would use very practical things like, good or bad outcomes, rather than saying there's any theology of evil. We just, we've got options, we've got choices. So, which may sound strange to a Christian, of course, I accept that, because you've got a whole theology of evil, and in a sense, the faith is bound up with it, because there's the fall, and then there's Jesus sort of rescuing from original sin and so forth, and baptism and saving in heaven and hell. But Judaism doesn't start from that premise. In the same way, and I hope I'm not going to shock anyone, we don't have a concept of hell either. So just to ask the question that probably someone's going to ask, so what is your concept? Judaism leaves the afterlife as a one massive question mark. We believe that, or we like to believe that something happens next. But what? We've got no clue. To be blunt, no one's ever sent a postcard back. And whereas Christianity has a very sort of a route map of the hereafter, sort of heaven and hell and limbo and perdition and so forth, Judaism just leaves it as a blank and just says, that's God's realm. You'll find out about it when you want, probably before you want. In the meantime, concentrate on the here and now. And it is a very, if you like, boringly here and now immediate faith, whereas Christianity does go much more into the next world. Now, some people find that a bit frustrating. It'd be nice to know what comes next. In fact, most Jews would like to know what comes next. But there's a very strong focus on, don't know, really don't know. I mean, just simple as that. You can speculate, but so what? Might be totally wrong, might be. So let's concentrate on the here and now.
But I just, my husband was asking, so I just want to make a comment that for Christians, it's sometimes very difficult to say, when somebody asks you, particularly somebody who's dying, what's going to happen to me, where am I going? As a priest, I can't honestly say I know. Because as you say, nobody sent a postcard back. We can only hang on to what we believe. But it's not certain knowledge, can't we?
Right.
No, thank you very much for that talk. Jewish and particularly religious humour is almost legendary. Is it, to some extent, just a way of coping, or is there more to it than that?
Well, there's no theology of humour. When I went to rabbinic college, and those were lessons in telling jokes, and actually, some rabbis can't tell jokes at all. But I'm not sure if I did anyway. Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's part of an outlook that sees life as good and fun and actually here to be enjoyed, and we want to make the best of things, and being Jewish is about making the best of yourself and living your potential to the full, but also getting on with other people. Humour, if humour helps, either making other people laugh or making yourself laugh, then good. In fact, there's a... no, it's all right, it's a distraction, don't worry.
Sure. We have time for one more question, I think. Sorry.
And what I was going to say while you're going over there, there's a story about how do you get to heaven. Not that we believe in heaven, but it's a useful sort of carrot. And apparently Elijah asked the question, and an angel said, those two over there. So he went over to them to see what they were doing that was so great, and they said, we're merrymakers. When we see people who are down, we cheer them up. When we see people who are quarrelling, we make peace between them. Now, you may think that's a bit simplistic, But number one, how many people actually do see people quarrelling and make peace between them? How many people do see someone who's sad and go and cheer them up? And also, even more importantly, it didn't say we are holy people, we pray, we are holy people, we do penances, we light candles. They said we cheer people up. So now, it's not about heaven, but it's about earth and how we spend our time on earth.
It's a bit of a big question to end with, but what place in Judaism for contemplatives, mystics, hermits? Is this a big tradition in Christianity?
Right. Big question, but because we haven't got much time, I'll give a short answer. What place do they have? None at all. In fact, without being rude, or without, sorry, I may be rude, but without intending to be rude, we don't have, we rather sort of frown on nuns and monks, because we see that life is good, and therefore God's gifts are to be enjoyed, and actually someone who shies away from the world, and also who avoids sex. I mean, sex is seen as a very good thing in Judaism. I mean, of those 613 commands that are taken from the 5 books of Moses, the first one is in Genesis, when we're doing the counting, which is be fruitful and multiply. Having children is a good thing. Now, not everyone can, for all sorts of reasons, but, one shouldn't deliberately hide oneself away and avoid it. There is no hang-ups with sex in Judaism about missionary positions or, sex is there to be enjoyed. And in the Talmud, which has some of these wise words that I quoted to you earlier, it also talks about, sexual relations between a husband and wife and so forth. So, yes, of course, you shouldn't go overboard and become so caught up with your own self-enjoyment you ignore others. The best type of Jew, like the best type of Christian, is someone who serves the wider community, but that's not by hiding away from people. Life is with the people, life is with the community. Another story, a bit banal, but has a message. There's 2 men in a boat, they're out on the seas. One of them starts drilling a hole in the rowing boat, and the other one says, "Oi, what are you doing? You're letting the water in." And he says, "No, I'm just doing it at my end." Well, in other words, we're all tied up together, and Hillel, a guy who I haven't mentioned, but is also another one of the biggies, his major saying, one of his major sayings was, "Do not isolate yourself from the rest of the community." So get stuck in. Hence my answer.
Well, that was a wonderful way to end. I'd like to thank you. I'm sure we could have gone on and on and on, actually, because more and more questions are certainly coming into my mind. But thank you very much for a fascinating talk, and I feel much clearer about things now.
The audience do too.
Thank you for coming. Can I just ask you before you go, when the rabbi arrived, he said, "There's no food afterwards." And I said, "No, we don't do that." But yeah, can you hear that? One of the things that the rabbi mentioned on his arrival was, "You're saying there's no food at the end of this," and I was rather embarrassed and said, "If there was food, would you all come? Would you bring your friends and neighbours? I mean, how popular an idea would that be for you?" Hands up. Yes. No, it will. We just do things a bit differently.
I wasn't complaining about me. It was just that we don't have lunchtime meetings without lunch. It's sitting up.
What we do and enjoy is bring our sandwich with us.
Yeah, that's fine. Yes. Anyhow, thank you all for coming. Next week we have